Well, that was probably the most awkward introduction I've ever done. Anyway, tonight's comparison is going to be between both versions of The Fly, and the synopsis to both of these films, if you're not familiar with it, is that there's this scientist who invents a teleportation machine, and as he goes to test the machine out on himself, a fly enters the teleportation pod with him without his knowledge, and a horrible transformation occurs. Now, aside from that bare bones synopsis, these two movies are about as different from each other as night and day, and one of the biggest differences is easily in the supporting cast. In the original film, the inventor Andre has a son who is played by the same little boy who was in 13 Ghosts. There's also an inspector who follows the rule of Disney, where even though the film takes place in France, he's one of the only two characters who speaks with a French accent. And also, Andre has a brother played by Vincent Price, and this isn't the type of character Price is usually known for. He's actually much more innocent and vulnerable in this film, and he's actually a very likable character. The remake mainly operates on three central characters, and one of them is this editor who works with the film's female protagonist, and he is easily the least likable character in the entire movie. He is extremely douchey, he's a stalker, he's verbally abusive, and says just a lot of disgusting things, even as things start to go bad in the film. And he does kind of make an attempt at redemption during the final act, but really it doesn't do much for his character. He's still a douche. Now, in regards to the female protagonist of The Fly, in the original film, Andre's wife is actually the main character of the movie, and it starts off after the main plot involving the teleportation and the transformation that it caused, and it starts right off after this woman has just murdered her husband in a very gruesome way. And as she's talking about the death of her husband, she just does so in this very scary, calm, and casual manner. By all accounts, it just appears that this woman severely needs to be locked away for life. But as she starts telling the story of what actually happened to Andre and what led to his death, she ends up providing a lot of emotional depth for the movie. As an audience member, you can really feel the heartbreak that this character is going through as things start to go horribly wrong. And one scene that just speaks tremendously about this actress's performance is where she's simply trying to capture a fly, and I have never been in more genuine suspense over such a simple act. Although one scene that was kind of iffy for me was after she hears about the loss of a family pet. She seems to take the news a little too well. In the remake, the female lead is played by Gina Gershon, and in this version she isn't even established as a love interest at the beginning. She's actually some journalist that the scientist runs into at a party, who then later becomes his girlfriend. And she doesn't even warm up to him right away, which is something you can hardly blame her for. And she's actually very sarcastic with his character. But once she starts to get to know him a little more, there is this very sweet romance that develops between the two. And then as the transformation starts to take hold of Seth Brundle, these romantic feelings eventually turn to conflict, and then genuine concern, and then finally heartbreak. And it is another great performance where the heartbreak is genuinely effective on the audience. And now, finally, onto the inventor in each version of The Fly and the transformation that he goes through. Now, in the original film, Andre doesn't necessarily come off as a mad scientist type right away. When you first see him on screen, he's actually very warm and charming and very loving towards his wife and son. And at the same time, he is able to exude this air of intelligence and you can buy that this guy could have built something so revolutionary as a teleportation machine. And then as the film goes on, you do start to see more of that mad scientist aspect of his character, where you see the process of struggle that he goes through as he's trying to perfect this machine that he's made, and also the obsession that goes into it. As for the transformation in the original film, I'm just gonna come out and say it. The effects have not aged well. I know that it is an older film and that they didn't have much technology at the time. And to be completely honest, the mask from that movie would look awesome if somebody was wearing it at a Halloween party or even at Comic-Con, but by today's standards, Pennywise the Spider looked more lifelike. With the remake, you've got Jeff Goldblum playing the inventor, whose name in this version is Seth Brundle. And at the beginning, it is easier to buy that this guy could in fact be a mad scientist. He's a lot more quirky and socially awkward. Again, you can't really blame Gina Gershon for not warming up to him on the spot. But at the same time, he is fairly likable, and you could buy that someone may find his characteristics endearing after spending time with the guy. And once the transformation begins to take place, the process in this version is much slower, and you get much more of a visual of what's happening, involving David Cronenberg's trademark body horror. And, it starts off with some minor visual effects, like these tough hairs sprouting up on Seth Brundle's back, as well as some little red spots on his face. But he doesn't seem to mind these at all, because he almost thinks he's turning into Spider-Man with this super strength and agility, as well as quicker reflexes. Unfortunately, this also causes him to become an egotistical asshole. And then after that, his behavior becomes more insect-like. He becomes a lot twitchier. There's this great special effects shot where you see him crawling on the ceiling and then on the wall. And, the transformation becomes increasingly uglier. I'm not going to go into full detail here, but he begins to lose body parts which are not exclusively needed by a fly. And as for his reactions to all this, once things begin falling off of him, he starts to lose that egotistical attitude and becomes much more terrified of what's going on. But then eventually, even this gives way to a false acceptance as his mental state starts to deteriorate along with his body and gives way to full-blown madness. So for my final thoughts on The Fly, I have to say this has been one of the easiest competitions for me all month. David Cronenberg's The Fly is one of my favorite movies of all time. The original is still very good story-wise despite its cheesy special effects, but for one thing, that movie was more of a straight adaptation of a short story, whereas David Cronenberg went in a much more creative and inventive direction with his version. And on top of that, it's one of the most emotionally involving movies I've seen from any genre. It makes me cry even more than The Fault in Our Stars, if you can believe that. So, really, if you haven't seen this movie, it does come strongly recommended. And that's all I've got to say for this comparison. As always, I hope you all have a good one.